In a land carved by sun and sorrow, a woman's compassion could be a death sentence. For Genevieve Hayes, a botanist who traded Boston society for the raw solitude of the Arizona Territory, a single choice on a blistering afternoon would change everything. She wasn't looking for a fight, and she certainly wasn't looking for a husband. But when she found a chief's son, bleeding and poisoned at the foot of a mesa, she chose to act. She thought she was just saving a life. She had no idea she was about to ignite a war and challenge the very definition of love and survival. The sun was a merciless hammer over the Gila bend, beating the color from the sky and baking the earth into a cracked ochre canvas. For Genevieve Hayes, this harsh landscape was a cathedral of resilience, a library of life forms that clung to existence with a tenacity she deeply admired. Her bonnet, stained with sweat and dust, did little to shield her from the oppressive heat, but she barely noticed. Her focus was on a cluster of Datura rhytae, the sacred Datura, its white trumpet-like flowers, a ghostly presence in the midday glare. She carefully sketched its form in her leather-bound journal, her graphite pencil scratching against the thick paper, a sound swallowed by the immense silence. She had come west 2 years ago, leaving behind the stifling parlors of Boston, and a future meticulously planned by a father who saw her as a marital asset rather than a mind. Here, under the vast, uncaring sky, she was simply Jenna, the quiet woman with the strange preoccupation with weeds and flowers. Her small, defensible homestead, nestled by a rare year-round spring, was her sanctuary. The people of nearby Redemption Gulch thought her peculiar, a spinster courting disaster, but their opinions were dust on the wind. Her work was her purpose. A sound sharp and unnatural broke her concentration. It wasn't the cry of a hawk or the scuttling of a lizard. It was a whimper, a human sound. Her hand froze over her drawing. Every instinct honed by 2 years of solitude screamed at her to retreat. This was territory where prospectors vanished, where conflicts between settlers and the local tribes flared like brush fires. A lone woman was a target. But the sound came again, weaker this time, a piteous mewling that snagged at a part of her she thought Boston had suffocated. Curiosity warred with fear and compassion, a foolish, dangerous thing in this land one. Securing her journal in her satchel, she picked up the sturdy walking stick she always carried and moved toward the sound, her steps cautious on the loose scree. She found him in the scant shade of a granite boulder. A boy no older than 9 or 10, his skin the rich reddish-brown of the local tribe. He was dressed in simple buckskin leggings and a breechcloth, his black hair matted with sweat and dirt. A deep gash on his calf, crusted with drying blood, was the most obvious injury, likely from a fall on the sharp rocks. But it was his other wound that made her breath catch. His small hand was swollen to twice its normal size, a violent purple red with 2 tiny puncture marks at its center. A bark scorpion, she knew instantly. Its sting was notoriously painful, and in a child, potentially lethal. The boy's eyes were glassy with fever, his lips cracked and pale. He flinched as she approached, a hiss of fear escaping his throat. He tried to scramble away, but a wave of nausea and pain sent him slumping back against the rock. "Easy now," Genevieve said, her voice soft, hoping the tone would convey her intent better than the words. "I'm not going to hurt you. Let me see." She knelt, keeping her movements slow and deliberate. She pointed to her own hand, then to his. "Scorpion," she said, tapping the back of her hand. "Bad. I can help." He stared at her, his dark eyes wide, with a mixture of terror and delirium. He was the son of the people, the ones the townsfolk called savages, the ones blamed for every missing cow and spooked horse. To him, She was the enemy, her pale skin and strange clothes a symbol of the invaders who were pushing his tribe from their ancestral lands. Genevieve ignored the gulf of politics and prejudice that separated them. Before her was a child dying. She opened her satchel, her hands moving with the practiced efficiency of a scientist. She pulled out a small glass vial of willow bark tincture, a potent pain reliever, and a pouch of dried poultice ingredients. First, however, she had to deal with the venom. "This will hurt," she murmured more to herself than to him. She took a small, sharp knife from her kit. The boy's eyes widened in panic, and he tried to pull his hand away. "Shh, shh. It's all right. Just for a moment." She held his small wrist firmly but gently, and with a swift, precise movement, made a tiny X over the twin punctures just deep enough to break the skin. A bead of dark blood and venom welled up. She immediately put her mouth to the wound, the metallic, bitter taste of his blood and the poison flooding her senses. She spat quickly and repeatedly onto the hot sand, drawing out as much of the venom as she could before it circulated further. The boy cried out a thin, wavering sound of pain and fear. His body was trembling violently now, the fever taking hold. She worked quickly, crushing the dried plantain leaves and mixing them with a bit of water from her canteen to form a thick green paste. She applied the poultice to the sting, the cool herbs designed to draw out the remaining venom and reduce the swelling. Next, she tended to the gash on his leg, cleaning it with carbolic soap and precious water, then binding it tightly with a strip of clean linen torn from her petticoat. As she worked, she spoke to him in a low, soothing monologue, telling him about the plants she studied, about the strength of the creosote bush and the deep roots of the mesquite. He wouldn't understand the words, but he might understand the calm. His trembling slowly subsided, and his breathing, while still shallow, grew more regular. She managed to get a few drops of the willow bark tincture and water between his cracked lips. The sun began its slow descent, painting the western sky in brutal strokes of orange and crimson. She knew she couldn't leave him here. He would die of exposure or a coyote would find him. But taking him to her homestead was a risk of staggering proportions. If his people found him there, what would they assume? Kidnapping worse. If the men from Redemption Gulch found him, they might lynch him simply for who he was. She looked down at the small, unconscious form. His face relaxed in a feverish sleep, was just a boy's face, innocent and vulnerable. The lines of conflict of race and territory blurred and vanished. He was a life entrusted to her by a cruel twist of fate. With a grunt of effort, Genevieve carefully hoisted him onto her back. His weight was a shock, a dense, solid burden that made her knees tremble. He was heavier than he looked, the dead weight of an unconscious child. She adjusted his limp limbs, securing him as best she could, and began the slow, arduous trek back to her cabin. Each step was a labor, the setting sun throwing her long, burdened shadow across the unforgiving land. She was carrying more than just a boy. She was carrying a choice, and she could feel its crushing weight with every footfall. The journey back was a Danton trial. Thorns tore at her skirt, and rocks turned under her worn leather boots. The boy's fevered breaths were hot against her neck. Twice she stumbled her own fatigue, warring with her determination. The world narrowed to the next step, and the next, the rhythmic pain in her shoulders and back, a constant companion. The stars emerged, cold and brilliant in the blackness, offering no comfort, only an awareness of her own insignificance in the vast, wild theater of the desert. She reached her cabin as the moon, a sliver of silver, crested the eastern peaks. The small stone and timber structure was more a fortress than a home, with heavy wooden shutters and a solid oak door. Inside, she gently laid the boy on her own cot, his small frame looking lost in the simple woolen blankets. For the next 2 days, the world outside her cabin ceased to exist. Her life became a cycle of cooling his fevered brow, with damp cloths forcing sips of water and thin broth between his lips and changing the poultices on his wounds. She learned the contours of his face, the way his eyelashes brushed his cheeks, the faint scar above his eyebrow. In his delirium, he murmured words in a language she didn't understand the syllables, soft and flowing. It was a strange and dangerous intimacy. She was nursing the son of an unknown warrior, a ghost from the forbidden lands beyond the settler's reach, and a profound sense of dread coiled in her stomach. She had crossed a line, and she knew there would be no going back. On the morning of the 3rd day, the fever broke. He woke with a gasp, his eyes clear and focused for the first time. When he saw her, he flinched and pushed himself up his gaze, darting around the unfamiliar room at the shelves of books, the neatly arranged jars of herbs, the strange pale light filtering through the window. Fear was a palpable thing in the small space. "You are safe," Genevieve said, holding up her hands in a gesture of peace. She pointed to his hand, the swelling now greatly reduced, and then to his bandaged leg. "Better now." He didn't speak. He watched her with an intensity that was unsettling in a child, the wary, ancient eyes of a people who had learned survival through mistrust. She offered him a bowl of corn mush, and after a long moment of hesitation, he took it, eating with a ravenous hunger that spoke of his ordeal. The confrontation she had been dreading came that afternoon. She was outside drawing water from the spring when a subtle change in the air made her freeze. The birds had fallen silent. The whisper of the wind through the cottonwoods seemed to hold its breath. She looked up and saw them. They stood at the edge of the clearing, materializing from the landscape, as if born of the earth itself. 5 men, silent and imposing. They were not painted for war, but their presence was an unsheathed blade. They carried bows and lances, and their eyes, dark and unreadable, were fixed on her. At their center stood a man who was clearly their leader. He was taller than the others, with a breadth of shoulder that spoke of immense power. His face was a mask of granite, carved with lines of hardship and authority, and his long black hair was held back by a simple leather band. There was no mistaking the fierce intelligence in his gaze. This was the boy's father. Genevieve's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drum in the sudden quiet. She did not run. She did not scream. She stood her ground, the water bucket handle clenched in her white-knuckled grip, and met the leader's stare. This was the moment of reckoning. He said nothing. He simply raised a hand, and the door to her cabin swung open. The boy, her patient, stood framed in the doorway. He looked at the men, and a single word escaped his lips, a word that sounded like a name, or perhaps father. He ran across the clearing and into the tall man's arms, burying his face in his father's buckskin leggings. The chieftain rested a hand on his son's head, his stern expression momentarily softening, with a flicker of relief so profound it was like seeing a crack appear in a mountain face. He examined the boy's hand, then the neatly bandaged leg. He looked from the wounds to Genevieve, his eyes sweeping over her, taking in her plain dress, her dirt-smudged hands, her defiant posture. He spoke, his voice a low rumble, like distant thunder. The words were in his own tongue, impossible for her to understand, yet their meaning was clear. It was a question, a demand for explanation. Genevieve took a slow breath, forcing her voice to remain steady. "He was hurt," she said, speaking slowly and clearly. "A scorpion. And a fall. I brought him here. I helped him." The leader, Kyle, did not seem to understand her words, but he understood the scene before him. his son alive and recovering, and the white woman who had clearly tended to him. He watched her for a long, silent moment, a moment that stretched into an eternity. His men remained as still as statues, their expressions unreadable. Genevieve felt as though her entire life was being weighed and judged in that single, silent gaze. She had expected anger, suspicion, perhaps even violence. She was not prepared for the complex, calculating intelligence she saw in his eyes. Finally, he gave a short, sharp nod. He turned to one of his men and spoke a few clipped words. The man stepped forward and extended a hand toward Genevieve. Lying in his palm was the pelt of a mountain lion, its fur thick and golden, its claws and teeth still intact. It was a gift of immense value and respect, a symbol of a great hunter. Genevieve hesitated. Accepting it would mean creating a bond, an acknowledgement of a debt between them. Refusing it would be a grave insult. With a trembling hand, she reached out and took the heavy pelt. Its weight was substantial, its fur soft and wild against her skin. Kyle gathered his son into his arms, the boy looking small and safe against his father's chest. Without another word or backward glance, he and his men turned and melted back into the wilderness, disappearing as silently as they had arrived. Genevieve was left standing alone in the clearing, the setting sun casting long shadows around her. The silence that descended was heavier than before, filled with unspoken questions. She clutched the magnificent pelt to her chest, the wild scent of the animal filling her lungs. She had saved a boy's life, and in return had received a chieftain's gratitude. But as she looked toward the empty space where they had stood, she felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening air. This was not an ending. It was a beginning. News in a place like Redemption Gulch traveled on the wind, morphing and twisting with each telling. Genevieve's return to town for supplies a week later was met with a new kind of attention. The usual dismissive curiosity had been replaced by a mixture of hushed suspicion and outright hostility. She felt it in the way mothers pulled their children closer as she passed in the narrowed eyes of the prospectors, drinking whiskey on the porch of the saloon, in the sudden silence that fell when she entered Abernathy's mercantile. Mr. Abernathy himself, a portly man with kind eyes and a perpetually worried expression, polished the counter with a nervous energy. "Jenna," he said, his voice a low whisper. "There are stories." "There usually are," Genevieve replied, her voice carefully neutral, as she placed her list on the counter. Flour, salt, coffee lamp oil. The mundane necessities of life felt absurdly out of place. "They're saying you're a sympathizer," he pressed on, not looking at her. "That you were harboring one of them, the boy who was lost. A child was hurt, William. I helped him. It's the beginning and end of the story." "It's never the end of the story out here," a new voice cut in, slick with false charm. Genevieve turned. Bartholomew Corrigan leaned against a stack of flour sacks, a possessive smirk on his face. He was the most powerful rancher in the territory, a man whose landholdings grew as mysteriously and inexorably as a cancer. He owned the sheriff, held the bank's charter, and treated Redemption Gulch as his personal fiefdom. His gaze roamed over Genevieve, proprietary and insulting. "Mr. Corrigan," she said, her tone clipped. "Miss Hayes," he drawled, pushing himself upright. He was a big man, soft in the middle, but with the ruthless eyes of a predator. "I hear you've been playing nursemaid to the savages, a dangerous hobby. They're more likely to repay you with a fire arrow than a thank you." "My hobbies are my own concern," she stated, turning back to the counter. "Now that's where you're wrong," Corrigan said, stepping closer. The scent of cheap cologne and cigars enveloped her. "Everything in this valley is my concern, especially when a lone woman on a prime piece of land starts getting friendly with the very vermin I'm trying to eradicate. That spring of yours. It makes your property exceptionally valuable." The threat was no longer veiled. It was as plain and ugly as the man delivering it. Her homestead with its reliable spring was a jewel in this arid land. Corrigan wanted it, and he was using her act of compassion as a pretext. "My deed is filed and legal," she said, her voice colder than she felt. "Deeds can get lost. Fires can happen. People can disappear," he said softly. His voice, a venomous whisper, meant only for her. "You'd be wise to consider my generous offer to buy you out. It won't stand forever, especially not for an Indian lover." He tipped his hat with mock politeness and sauntered out, leaving a chill in the warm, dusty air of the store. Sheriff Brody, who had been lingering by the door, gave Genevieve a hard, complicit stare before following his master. "You see," Abernathy murmured, his face pale. "He's been looking for a reason to move on you, Jenna. You just handed him one on a silver platter." Genevieve finished her shopping in a haze of anger and fear. The town now felt like a cage, its people the bars. As she loaded her supplies onto her mule, she noticed 2 of Corrigan's men, Flint among them, watching her from across the street. They weren't hiding it. They wanted her to know she was being observed, that her isolation was now complete. The ride home was fraught with a new tension. Every rustle in the brush, every shadow that flickered at the edge of her vision was a potential threat. Her sanctuary, her beautiful, harsh cathedral, now felt menacing. She found the proof of Corrigan's warning waiting for her. The scent of smoke hit her first, acrid and sickening. As she rounded the last bend, her heart seized. A section of her carefully tended research garden, where she cultivated rare medicinal plants, was a blackened, smouldering ruin. In the center of the charred patch, an arrow was stuck in the ground. It was crudely made with gray goose feathers, the kind a white man would fashion to look like native handiwork. It was a clear, brutal message. This is what the savages do. This is what will happen to you. Corrigan wasn't just trying to scare her. He was building a narrative painting her as a victim of the very people she had helped a story that would justify whatever he chose to do next. That night, Genevieve sat in her cabin, a shotgun across her lap, watching the shadows dance in the moonlight outside her window. The mountain lion pelt lay across a chair, a stark, wild reminder of another world. She had fled Boston to escape a gilded cage, only to find herself in a deadlier, more primitive one. She was alone, cornered, and her enemy was a man who believed the land and everyone on it belonged to him. The quiet solitude she had cherished had become a terrifying vulnerability. Fear was a cold knot in her stomach, but beneath it, a different feeling was taking root, a hard, defiant anger. Bartholomew Corrigan had mistaken her kindness for weakness. It was a mistake she would make him regret. For 3 nights, Genevieve existed in a state of hypervigilant sleep, coming only in short, fitful bursts. She barricaded the door with a heavy chest and spent the daylight hours fortifying her small homestead, reinforcing the shutters and creating deadfall traps on the main paths leading to the cabin, using the knowledge of mechanics her father had ironically insisted she learn. She was a scientist, and she would approach her survival as a grim, logical experiment. On the 4th evening, as twilight bled across the sky, he came again. She was so attuned to the sounds of Corrigan's men that she almost missed the subtler arrival. There was no cracking twig, no heavy footfall. One moment the clearing was empty. The next, Cale stood there alone. He was not armed for battle, carrying only a long-bladed knife at his belt. He stood with a stillness that was absolute a part of the landscape she had failed to notice. Genevieve raised the shotgun, the smooth wood cool against her cheek, and centered the barrel on his chest. "That's far enough," she called out, her voice tight. Cale did not flinch. He simply raised a hand palm open, a universal sign of peace. He then pointed toward the burned patch of her garden, his expression grim. He had seen it. He understood. "What do you want?" she demanded, her fear making her sharp. Was he here to finish the job Corrigan had started? Was the pelt a trick, a softening gesture before the final blow? He took 2 slow steps forward and stopped. He began to speak, not in his own tongue, but in halting, heavily accented English. The words were simple, carefully chosen, learned from traders or captives long ago. "The cattleman," he said, his deep voice giving the foreign words a strange gravity. "Corrigan. He burns your earth. He uses my people's sign." Genevieve was stunned into silence. He knew. Of course he knew. His people would have seen the smoke found the tracks of Corrigan's men. They would have understood the deception immediately. "He wants this land," Kyle continued, gesturing to the spring. "This water. It is life. He pushes my people from the mountains. He poisons the rivers. Now he pushes you." "I am aware of what he wants," Genevieve said, not lowering the gun. "Why are you here?" Kyle looked directly at her, and his gaze was not that of a savage, but of a king surveying his battlefield. "You saved my son, my blood. This is a great debt, a debt my people honor. You have the heart of a warrior to stand alone against the storm." He paused, letting the words settle in the cooling air. "The cattleman will not stop. He will send more men. He will burn this house. He will kill you. A woman alone is a rabbit before the wolf." "I can take care of myself," she retorted, though the words sounded hollow even to her own ears. "No," he said, the word flat and final. "You cannot. Not against him. But you do not have to be alone." It was then that he made the most astonishing, most unthinkable proposition of her life. "I am Cale, leader of the people of the Red Cliff. I have 2 wives. They are good women, mothers to my children. They are wise in counsel. I offer you a place as my 3rd wife." The shotgun suddenly felt immensely heavy. Genevieve stared at him, certain she had misheard, that the strain had made her mind snap. "You what?" "You become my wife," he repeated, as if explaining a simple truth to a child. "You will be one of us. This house, this land, will be under my protection. An attack on you is an attack on my people. Corrigan is a coward. He attacks a lone woman. He will not attack a chieftain's wife. He does not want a war with us. Not yet." Genevieve's mind reeled. This wasn't a proposal of love or affection. It was a treaty, a strategic alliance offered in the form of a marriage vow. He was offering her the one thing Corrigan couldn't fight: the strength of a tribe. He was offering her survival. "You want to marry me, to protect my property?" She asked, the absurdity of it making her feel lightheaded. "To protect you," he corrected, his eyes intense. "The land is secondary. You saved my blood. I will not see your blood spilled on this ground. It is a matter of honor." She finally lowered the gun, her arms trembling. The implications of his offer crashed down on her. To accept meant abandoning every convention she had ever known. It meant tying herself to a man and a culture that were a universe away from her own. She would become a pariah to the white world, the Indian wife, an object of scorn and revulsion. She would be giving up her independence, the very thing she had traveled 2,000 miles to find. But to refuse refusal meant facing Corrigan and his men alone. It meant a lonely, violent death in the dust. Her research, her life's work, turned to ash. "Why?" she whispered, the question raw. "Why would you do this for me?" Cale's expression shifted a flicker of something she couldn't name, not softness, but a deep, resonant understanding crossing his features. When my son was in your house, he was afraid. But you were not. You did not see an enemy. You saw a child. You fought for his life when it would have been easier to let him die. This is a rare thing. Strength is not just in the arm that holds the spear. It is in the heart that knows when to heal. My people need such strength. I need such strength in my allies. He had chosen the last word carefully. He was not asking her to be a submissive bride. He was asking her to be a partner in a war he was already fighting. He was offering his hand, not in romance, but in a pact of mutual survival. He held her gaze, his dark eyes demanding an answer. The choice is yours, Genevieve Hayes, the rabbit's death or the mountain lion's protection. Decide. He turned and walked to the edge of the clearing, then stopped his back to her. I will return in 2 days. With your answer. He disappeared into the twilight, leaving Genevieve alone, with a choice that would not only determine her future, but redefine her very existence. The simple life of a botanist was over. The life of a survivor had begun. The next 2 days were a fevered dream of indecision. Genevieve paced the confines of her small cabin, the floorboards groaning under her relentless steps. Kyle's proposition echoed in her mind, a radical, terrifying, and strangely logical solution to her predicament. She dissected it with a scientist's precision, listing the pros and cons in her journal. On one side, utter ruin of her reputation, the abandonment of her culture, a life bound to a man she did not know, a polygamist chieftain, from a world she could not possibly comprehend. It was a leap into an abyss. On the other side, life itself, the protection to continue her work, a powerful, if dangerous ally against a ruthless enemy. And something else, something she was hesitant to admit even to herself, a profound respect for the man who had made the offer. Kyle was not a savage. He was a leader, a strategist, a father willing to forge an unprecedented alliance, to honor a debt and protect his own. There was a raw integrity to him that she had never encountered in the perfumed drawing rooms of Boston or the greedy, grasping world of Redemption Gulch. Her decision was made for her on the second morning. She was checking the perimeter of her property when she found it near the spring. The water, usually so clear it was like looking through glass, was cloudy with an oily sheen on its surface. At the bottom of the pool lay the bloated carcass of a dead coyote, its lips drawn back in a rictus of agony. Someone had poisoned her water source. It was Corrigan's move, an act of calculated cruelty designed to be the final checkmate. Without water, her land was worthless, her survival impossible. He hadn't just attacked her garden. He had attacked the very lifeblood of her existence. The cold fury that filled her burned away all remaining doubt. This was no longer just about survival. It was about defiance. She would not be driven from her home by a coward who poisoned wells. When Kyle appeared at the edge of the clearing as the sun began to set, she was waiting for him. She wore a simple but clean dress, her hair neatly brushed and tied back. She held no gun. He stopped his eyes, questioning. "I have my answer," she said, her voice clear and strong. "I accept your proposition. But I have terms." A flicker of surprise, perhaps even amusement, crossed his face. He inclined his head, granting her permission to speak. "This is a partnership," she stated, "not a surrender. This land remains my own. My work continues. I will be your wife and stand with your people, but I will not be a servant. I will be treated with respect, not as property." Kyle listened, his expression unreadable. For a long moment he was silent. Then he gave a slow, deliberate nod. "It is as I said. An ally. Your terms are the terms of a warrior. They are accepted." The wedding was nothing like any ceremony she could have imagined. It was not a union of love, but the solemn forging of a pact. Kyle did not bring a crowd of his people. He brought only one other, an old woman, with a face like a wrinkled map, her eyes, holding the wisdom of generations. Her name, he said, was Teani, and she was a keeper of traditions. The ceremony took place by the now cleansed spring, under the watchful eyes of the ancient cottonwood trees. There were no rings, no vows of love and honor. Teani chanted in a low, mesmerizing voice, her words seeming to blend with the whisper of the wind. She took a small clay bowl, filling it with water from the spring. She added a pinch of dirt from the land at Genevieve's feet, and a single drop of blood from both Kyle's thumb and Genevieve's pricked with the sharp point of an obsidian knife. Teani stirred the mixture with a feather and offered the bowl to Kyle. He drank half his eyes, never leaving Genevieve's. Then he passed the bowl to her. Her hand trembled as she took it. The gritty, earthy liquid was cool on her tongue. It tasted of the land of life and of the blood pact she was making. When she had drunk, Teani took the bowl and smashed it against a stone, the shards scattering on the ground. The pact was sealed. There was no turning back. That night, Genevieve did not sleep in her cabin. Kyle led her a short distance away to a temporary camp. He had made a simple lean-to, sheltered by a rock outcropping. A small fire crackled, casting dancing shadows. He laid out 2 bedrolls, one on either side of the fire. There was an awkward, profound silence between them. They were husband and wife, yet they were strangers from different centuries, different worlds. "You are not afraid?" he asked, his voice low. "I'm terrified," Genevieve answered honestly, looking into the flames. "But my fear of Corrigan is greater than my fear of the unknown." "The unknown is not your enemy," Kyle said. "My other wives. They will not welcome you at first. You must earn their trust. My people will watch you. They will test you. Do not show weakness." "I am a botanist, not a warrior," she said. "You survived alone in this land for 2 years. You faced down my warriors with a water bucket. You faced me with a gun." He countered a ghost of a smile, touching his lips for the first time. "You are more of a warrior than you know." He then unrolled a hide and showed her designs maps of the surrounding territory drawn in charcoal. He pointed out Corrigan's main ranch, his grazing lands, the paths his men used. He explained the tribe's own movements, their sacred sites, the places they hunted. He was not treating her as a bride, but as a military advisor, sharing intelligence. He was already honoring his side of the bargain. As she lay in her bedroll that night, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the desert and the steady breathing of the man on the other side of the fire, Genevieve Hayes felt the last vestiges of her old life fall away. She had made a vow not of the heart, but of strategy. She had married a chieftain to save her home, only to realize she had just stepped onto a much larger and more dangerous battlefield. The alliance was immediately put to the test. Kyle left 2 of his best warriors, a quiet man named Hawkeye, and a younger, fiercer one called Wolf, camped in the hills overlooking Genevieve's homestead. Their presence was a silent, constant deterrent. The message to Corrigan was unmistakable. The Hayes woman and her spring were now under native protection. For a few weeks, an uneasy peace settled over the valley. Corrigan's men were no longer seen near her property. Genevieve began the painstaking work of restoring her poisoned spring, a task that Kyle's people with their deep knowledge of the earth aided her in. Teani showed her which roots could be used to absorb the poison, a piece of ancient wisdom that astounded Genevieve with its efficacy. She found herself in a strange new rhythm, her days spent on her botanical research, her evenings often spent in quiet, practical conversation with Kyle, who visited every few days. He taught her about the land from his perspective, not as a collection of scientific specimens, but as a living entity filled with spirits and stories. She in turn shared her knowledge of medicine, showing him how to make stronger tinctures and more effective salves for wounds. A fragile bridge of mutual respect was being built between them, stone by careful stone. But Bartholomew Corrigan was not a man to accept defeat. He was a serpent, and when cornered, he would strike with desperate venom. He knew a direct assault on Cale's main encampment would be suicide, but an attack on the isolated homestead of his new wife, that was a different matter. It would be a pointed, humiliating blow against the chieftain, proving that his protection was worthless. The attack came at dusk, the time of day. The desert holds its breath between the searing heat of the day and the chill of the night. Genevieve was inside, cataloguing seeds by the light of a lantern, when the first gunshot shattered the evening quiet. The bullet splintered the window frame, showering her table with wood and glass. Instantly, the war cries of Hawkeye and Wolf echoed from the hills, followed by the answering crack of their rifles. But they were only two men. A volley of gunfire erupted from the trees surrounding the clearing, far more than two men could handle. Corrigan had come in force. Genevieve scrambled for the shotgun, her heart pounding, a frantic rhythm of pure adrenaline. She doused the lantern, plunging the cabin into darkness. Peering through a crack in the shutters, she saw them at least a dozen of Corrigan's men, led by his brutal foreman, Flint, advancing on the cabin in a skirmish line, using the rocks and trees for cover. A second volley of shots slammed into the cabin walls, the heavy thud of lead burying itself in the thick timber. This was it. The rabbit's death Kyle had spoken of. But Kyle had underestimated her. She wasn't just a rabbit. She was a scientist in her own fortress. Before the attack, she and Kale had walked the property, and she had pointed out the traps she had laid. Now she prayed they would work. A scream of agony from the east side of the cabin was followed by a sickening crunch. One of Corrigan's men had stumbled into a deadfall pit. She had camouflaged its bottom, lined with sharpened stakes. One down. Flint's voice roared through the twilight. Spread out, circle the cabin. Burn her out. She could hear them moving, their boots crunching on the dry earth. She moved from window to window, a ghost in the dark, trying to track their positions. A dark shape darted between two boulders. She raised the shotgun, aimed for the center of the mass, and fired. The weapon kicked back against her shoulder with bruising force, the roar of the blast deafening in the small space. A man cried out and fell. From outside she heard Flint bellow in fury. "She's armed, keep your heads down!" Then came a new sound, the whoosh and crackle of fire. They were throwing torches onto the roof. The dry timber, baked by years of sun, would catch quickly. Panic, cold and sharp, lanced through her. She was trapped. Just as the smell of smoke began to fill the cabin, a new sound joined the cacophony of the battle, a high, chilling war cry that was answered from multiple directions at once. It wasn't just two warriors anymore. Kyle had come. Warriors seemed to erupt from the very ground, moving with a speed and silence that was terrifyingly efficient. Arrows hissed through the air, finding their marks with deadly precision. Corrigan's men, who had been focused on the cabin, were caught in a deadly crossfire. Their organized attack dissolved into chaos. Men shouted in fear and confusion, firing blindly into the shadows. Genevieve watched, mesmerized, as Cale moved through the battle like a vengeful spirit. He was not the calm strategist she had come to know. He was a whirlwind of controlled violence, his knife and tomahawk, a blur of motion. He moved with a purpose that was both terrifying and magnificent. He was protecting his territory. He was protecting his wife. The fight was short and brutal. Caught between the cabin and the surprise attack, Corrigan's men broke and fled, dragging their wounded with them. Flint, trying to mount his horse, was brought down by an arrow from Hawkeye that pinned his leg to his saddle. He lay screaming on the ground until Kyle stood over him, silencing him with a cold, final look. The clearing fell silent, the only sounds the crackle of the fire on the roof and the groans of the wounded. Genevieve threw open the door bucket in hand and rushed to douse the flames. Warriors immediately joined her, forming a chain from the spring, their movements disciplined and effective. When the fire was out, she stood in the moonlight, her face smudged with soot, her dress torn. The clearing was littered with the bodies of Corrigan's men. Kyle walked toward her, his face a grim mask, a cut bleeding freely from his forearm. He stopped in front of her, his chest rising and falling heavily. His eyes scanned her, checking for injuries. "You are not hurt?" he asked, his voice rough. "No," she managed to say, her voice trembling. "Thanks to you." He looked at the two dead men she had shot. Then he looked at her, and his eyes held a new, deeper level of respect. "You fought," he said. It was not a question. It was a statement of fact, of surprise and approval. "You told me not to show weakness," she replied, finding a sliver of her old resolve. He reached out not to touch her, but to gently pull a piece of smoldering debris from her hair. His fingers brushed her temple, a fleeting, unintentional touch that sent a jolt through her entire body. It was the first time they had made physical contact since the ceremony. In the midst of death and violence, it was an act of shocking intimacy. "Corrigan will pay for this," he vowed, his voice a low growl. "He has shed the blood of my people on my wife's land. He has declared war." Genevieve looked around at the carnage, at the silent warriors retrieving their arrows, at the dark shape of her home, silhouetted against the starry sky. This was her life now, a life of smoke and blood, of strange alliances and deadly enemies. She had accepted Kyle's hand to survive, but tonight, fighting alongside him, she realized she had done more than that. She had chosen a side. The aftermath of the battle was stark and grim. Kyle and his warriors dealt with the fallen swiftly and without ceremony, a grim task performed under the cold, indifferent light of the moon. They took Flint captive, binding him securely, his fate to be decided by the tribe. This was not settler justice. It was the justice of a sovereign people whose land and kin had been attacked. Genevieve moved through the motions of tending to the wounded, her hands usually steady over a delicate plant specimen, now cleaning and binding the cuts and arrow wounds of Kyle's men. She worked alongside Tayani, who had arrived with the others, the two of them communicating through gestures and a shared understanding of the healing arts. In the shared bloody work of mending bodies, Genevieve felt another thread of connection to this tribe being woven. Kyle himself submitted to her care, sitting silently on a log as she cleaned the gash on his forearm. His proximity was overwhelming. She could feel the heat radiating from his body, smell the scent of sweat blood, and the wild, clean smell of the desert night that always clung to him. She worked methodically, her focus on the task, trying to ignore the way the muscles in his arm tensed under her touch. "You have a healer's hands," he said, his voice quiet, breaking the silence between them. "I have a scientist's hands," she corrected softly. "I observe and I try to mend what is broken." "Sometimes the broken things cannot be mended," he said, his gaze distant, looking out over the valley where Corrigan's ranch lay. "They must be cut away." The next day, Kyle left with his warriors and their prisoner, but his promise of retribution was not idle. The war he had spoken of did not come in a great crashing wave, but in 1,000 small debilitating cuts. Corrigan's cattle vanished in the night. His supply wagons were found with their axles broken and their cargo spoiled. His line riders, terrified of the unseen enemy that haunted the canyons, began to desert. Corrigan found himself besieged, his empire slowly strangled by a ghost army that knew every rock and every shadow of the land he sought to control. He never attacked Genevieve's homestead again. The price had been too high. The cabin, once a symbol of her vulnerability, had become a symbol of Kyle's power and reach. The story in Redemption Gulch twisted once more. She was no longer the foolish sympathizer. She was the chieftain's woman, a figure of fear and speculation, a white woman who had somehow crossed over to the other side. Genevieve continued her work, but it was changed. She was no longer just a solitary scholar. Kyle would send for her, seeking her counsel. She would sit in his camp, a strange and respected presence among his people and his other wives, two strong, proud women who, after a period of intense suspicion, had come to accept her as a fellow strategist in their people's fight for survival. They saw that she sought no favor from their husband, only the security of the alliance. She advised him on Corrigan's likely tactics, using her understanding of the white man's greed and logic. She taught his people basic sanitation and introduced new herbs that could fight the sicknesses brought by the settlers. In return, they taught her. She learned their language, the names of the stars in their sky, the ancient stories that gave life to the landscape. She learned a different way of seeing the world, not as something to be catalogued and conquered, but as a complex, interconnected web of life to which she belonged. Months passed. The seasons turned. Bartholomew Corrigan, broken by the relentless, silent war, finally sold his holdings for a fraction of their worth and disappeared back east a defeated man. The threat was gone. The alliance forged in desperation was no longer a necessity. One evening, Kyle came to her cabin. The air was peaceful. The spring flowed clear and pure. "He is gone," Kyle said, standing on her porch. "The serpent has fled his nest. Our agreement is fulfilled. You are safe." Genevieve looked at him, at the proud, powerful man who had offered her his name as a shield. The terms of their arrangement were met. She was by all rights free. She could dissolve the pact, remain on her land as she had always wanted, alone and independent. The thought should have brought her relief. Instead, it felt like a loss. "And now?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. He looked at her, his dark eyes searching her face. The space between them was filled with everything they had been through: the scorpion sting, the burned garden, the blood-soaked battle, the quiet counsels. Theirs was a relationship built not on courtship and whispers of love, but on shared danger, mutual respect, and the grim business of survival. It was something stronger, deeper, and more real than any romance she had ever read about. "Now," he said slowly, "you have a choice. Again, you can stay here alone as Genevieve Hayes, the botanist. My people will still honor you as a friend. We will watch over you from a distance." He paused. "Or you can remain as you are, Kyle's wife, an ally, a counselor to my people, a part of our future." He was not commanding her. He was not assuming. He was offering her a place she had earned, a life she had unwittingly built for herself. He was giving her the choice to remain bound not by necessity, but by a new unspoken loyalty. Genevieve looked past him at the vast desert stretching out under a sky awash with the colors of sunset. She had come here seeking solitude and had found a community. She had come seeking independence and had found a partnership. She had come to study life and had found herself fighting for it, living it more fiercely than she ever thought possible. She met his gaze, and for the first time, She allowed herself to see the man, not just the chieftain. She saw the lines of care around his eyes, the strength in his jaw, the quiet intelligence that had seen her for who she was from the very beginning. "I believe," she said, a small, genuine smile touching her lips, "that I am already home." He did not smile back, but the harsh lines of his face softened. He gave a single profound nod of understanding. He had offered his hand in marriage to repay a debt, but in doing so they had both found something far more valuable. In the heart of the Wild West, under the vast and unforgiving sky, two worlds had collided and created a new one, a life forged not of passion, but of a rare and resilient respect. And for Genevieve, it was a dawn more beautiful than any she had ever seen. And so Genevieve Hayes, the botanist from Boston, found her true purpose not in the pages of a book, but in the heart of a nation fighting for its life. Her story is a testament to the fact that courage isn't the absence of fear, but the choice to act in spite of it. It shows us that alliances can be found in the most unexpected places, and that respect is a language more powerful than any spoken word. The Wild West was a place of brutal endings, but for some it was also a place of extraordinary new beginnings. If this story of bravery, honor, and the surprising bonds that tie us together resonated with you, please take a moment to click that like button. Share it with someone who loves a tale of the untamed frontier. And most importantly, subscribe to our channel for more stories like this one, where we uncover the forgotten dramas and hidden histories of the American West. Thank you for listening.